If someone had asked me to describe my husband before the day he died, I would have smiled without hesitation. I would have told them that Daniel was kind, dependable, and the one person who always made me feel safe. I would have said I was one of the lucky ones. For 15 years, I believed I had married an honest man. We weren't the couple who constantly posted perfect pictures online or tried to convince the world that our lives were flawless. We were simply two people who had built a quiet, comfortable life together, one ordinary day at a time. Looking back now, I realize how dangerous the word ordinary can be. Because sometimes, the biggest secrets hide inside the most ordinary lives. I met Daniel when I was 28 years old. I had recently accepted a position as a high school English teacher in a small town outside Boston. Teaching had always been my dream, even though it wasn't the highest paying career. I loved watching young people discover confidence through words and stories. Daniel worked as a regional sales manager for a medical equipment company. His job required frequent travel, something he mentioned on our second date. "I spend more time in airports than I do at home," he joked. I laughed. "Then I hope you like phone calls." "I'll call every night." It sounded like a promise. And for many years, it was one he kept. Our relationship developed slowly. There were no dramatic love stories or movie-like moments. Instead, there were simple things. Weekend breakfasts at our favorite diner. Long conversations while walking through local parks. Road trips where we sang terribly to old songs on the radio. Those ordinary moments slowly became the foundation of our marriage. 2 years later, Daniel proposed during a weekend getaway to a quiet lakeside cabin. There were no photographers hiding in the trees. No audience. No elaborate speech. He simply took my hands, looked into my eyes, and said, "I don't promise a perfect life. I promise you'll never have to face life alone." I said yes before he even finished. Our wedding was beautiful because it felt genuine. Family and close friends surrounded us. Everyone commented on how perfectly we complemented each other. Daniel was calm where I was emotional. I was organized where he was spontaneous. People often joked that we balanced each other perfectly. For a long time, I believed they were right. The first several years of our marriage passed peacefully. Daniel traveled often for work. Sometimes 3 days. Sometimes an entire week. At first, I hated saying goodbye at airports. But eventually, we found our rhythm. Every evening, no matter where he was, he called me. Sometimes from hotel rooms. Sometimes from rental cars parked outside restaurants. Sometimes while waiting for delayed flights. Those conversations became part of our routine. "How was your day? What did your students do today? Did you remember to eat lunch?" They weren't exciting conversations. But they made the distance feel smaller. When our son Ethan was born, Daniel cried before I did. Holding our newborn, he whispered, "I'm going to spend my whole life making sure this little guy knows he's loved." Watching him become a father made me love him even more. He wasn't perfect. He forgot grocery lists. He left socks on the bedroom floor. He could never remember where he put his keys. But he loved Ethan deeply. At least, that's what I believed. As Ethan grew older, Daniel's career continued improving. Promotions brought bigger responsibilities. Bigger responsibilities meant more travel. "I know I'm gone a lot," he told me one evening while packing another suitcase. "But everything I'm doing is for us." I smiled. I know. And I truly believed it. Financially, life became easier. We bought a beautiful home. We finally took the family vacations we had spent years dreaming about. Ethan attended a wonderful school. Friends often admired our life. "You two make marriage look easy," one of my co-workers once said. I laughed. "It's not easy. We just choose each other every day." Those words would later haunt me. Because I believed Daniel was making the same choice. I never imagined he was living an entirely different life whenever he boarded another plane. There were moments, of course, when little things didn't quite make sense. Sometimes he'd come home with gifts I hadn't expected. Other times, he'd seem emotionally distant for a day or two before returning to normal. Occasionally, he'd receive phone calls and step outside to answer them. When I asked if everything was okay, he'd smile. Just work. I never questioned him. Trust isn't built overnight. It's built through thousands of ordinary moments. And Daniel had earned mine. At least, I thought he had. One autumn evening, while we were sitting on our back porch watching the leaves fall, I asked him a question that seemed completely harmless. Do you ever get tired of traveling? He looked toward the sunset before answering. Sometimes. Then why don't you ask for a position that keeps you closer to home? He smiled gently. Because someday I'll retire. And when I do, I want us to have everything we've ever dreamed about. I reached for his hand. You already are everything I've ever dreamed about. He squeezed my hand and smiled. But looking back now, there was something different about that smile. Almost guilty. At the time, I ignored it. Love has a way of explaining away things that logic quietly notices. Years passed. Life continued moving forward. Ethan graduated from high school and left for college. The house suddenly became quieter. Daniel and I talked about traveling together more often once his workload slowed down. We planned future vacations. We talked about growing old together. We even joked about becoming the kind of grandparents who spoiled their grandchildren. Our future felt certain. Or at least it felt that way to me. Then, one cold November morning, everything changed. I was grading essays during my planning period when my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. Normally, I would have ignored it. Instead, I answered. Is this Mrs. Harper? Yes. My name is Officer Reynolds. My heart immediately began racing. There has been an accident. Everything after those words became a blur. Daniel had been driving to meet a client when another vehicle crossed the center line during heavy rain. The collision was severe. The paramedics had done everything they could. But my husband never made it to the hospital. I don't remember driving there. I don't remember calling Ethan. I don't even remember signing the paperwork. I only remember seeing Daniel one final time. He looked peaceful. As if he were simply sleeping. I held his hand and whispered through tears. You promised I'd never have to face life alone. For days, our home filled with flowers, sympathy cards, casseroles from neighbors, and relatives offering comfort. Everyone spoke about what a wonderful husband and father Daniel had been. How hardworking he was. How devoted he seemed. I believed every word. As we prepared for the funeral, I thought the hardest part of my life would be learning how to live without the man I loved. I had no idea that burying my husband wasn't going to be the most painful moment of that week. The real heartbreak was still waiting for me. And it would arrive just as the funeral service began, carried by strangers whose very presence would shatter everything I believed I knew about the man I had shared my life with. The morning of Daniel's funeral arrived beneath a gray sky that seemed to reflect exactly how I felt inside. I barely slept the night before. Every time I closed my eyes, I expected to wake up and discover the phone call had been a nightmare. I wanted to hear Daniel walking through the front door, complaining about airport delays or asking what I wanted for dinner. Instead, I woke up to silence. A silence that reminded me he was never coming home. By the time Ethan and I arrived at the funeral home, the parking lot was already filling with cars. Friends, relatives, neighbors, and co-workers gathered outside, speaking in quiet voices. Some hugged me. Others simply held my hand, unable to find words that could make sense of such a loss. I'm so sorry, Claire, my sister whispered as she wrapped her arms around me. So am I. It was all I could manage to say. Inside the chapel, soft piano music played as people took their seats. At the front of the room rested Daniel's closed casket, surrounded by white lilies and framed photographs from different stages of his life. There was one from our wedding day. One of him holding Ethan as a baby. Another from our 20th wedding anniversary, where we were both smiling at the camera. Looking at those pictures made my chest ache. How could someone who filled so many memories suddenly become a photograph? The minister welcomed everyone and began speaking about Daniel's kindness, his dedication to his family, and the way he always worked hard to provide for the people he loved. Every word sounded true. Every memory felt real. I cried quietly while holding Ethan's hand. Then, halfway through the service, the chapel doors opened. At first, I didn't think much of it. People often arrived late to funerals. But this wasn't just one person. A woman entered, followed by 2 children, a little girl who looked about 9 and a boy who couldn't have been older than 7. The woman looked nervous, almost frightened. She wasn't dressed like someone attending a stranger's funeral. She looked like someone grieving. She scanned the room until her eyes settled on Daniel's casket. The little girl squeezed her hand. "Mom," she whispered. "Is Daddy really in there?" The words echoed through the silent chapel. Daddy. For a second, I thought I had misunderstood. Then several people turned toward the woman. Whispers spread across the room. The woman immediately realized everyone was staring. She looked embarrassed and tried to lead the children toward the back row. But the little boy spoke again. "I want to say goodbye to Dad." My heart stopped. I stared at them, unable to breathe. Surely there had been a mistake. Maybe Daniel had mentored these children. Maybe they simply called him Dad as a nickname. My mind desperately searched for explanations that made sense. Because the alternative was impossible. The minister paused awkwardly. The room became painfully quiet. I slowly stood from my seat. Every pair of eyes followed me. I walked toward the woman, my legs trembling with every step. When I reached her, I forced myself to speak calmly. "I'm sorry." My voice barely worked. "I think you may have the wrong funeral." The woman looked at me with confusion. "No." She shook her head gently. "This is Daniel Harper's service." My stomach tightened. "Yes." She smiled sadly. "He was my husband." The world around me seemed to disappear. I couldn't hear the piano anymore. I couldn't hear people whispering. I couldn't even feel the floor beneath my feet. I stared at her, convinced I had misunderstood. "I'm his wife." The woman's face turned completely white. "No." She whispered. "That's impossible." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. We simply stared at each other. 2 women. Both believing they were standing before strangers. Then the little girl stepped closer. She looked up at me with innocent eyes. "Are you Daddy's friend?" My heart shattered. The child looked so much like Daniel. She had his smile. His eyes. Even the way she tilted her head when asking a question reminded me of him. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't coincidence. She looked like his daughter. The woman slowly reached into her purse with shaking hands. I don't understand." She pulled out her wallet and removed a family photograph. "There must be some mistake." She handed it to me. The moment I looked at the picture, I felt my knees weaken. There was Daniel. Standing beside this woman. One arm around her shoulders. The 2 children smiling in front of them. It wasn't an edited image. It wasn't fake. It was a family portrait. A family portrait that included my husband. Someone caught me before I fell. I don't remember who. The room erupted into whispers. People looked confused. Some looked horrified. Others refused to believe what they were seeing. My brother-in-law quietly took the photograph from my trembling hands. His face lost all color. "Oh my God. he whispered. The woman looked at me again. When did you marry Daniel? Her question felt surreal. I married him 15 years ago. She stared at me. I've been married to him for 11. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us could. The impossible had somehow become reality. Ethan walked toward us, confused. Mom? He looked at the children. Then at the photograph. Then back at me. What's happening? I couldn't answer. I didn't know how. How do you explain something you don't understand yourself? The woman covered her mouth as tears streamed down her face. He told me his parents were gone. He said he didn't have any close family. I whispered. He told me business kept him traveling. Our eyes met. And in that single moment, we both realized something horrifying. Neither of us had been the other woman. We had both been victims of the same lie. Daniel hadn't simply had an affair. He had lived two completely separate lives. Two homes. Two marriages. Two families. For more than a decade. The funeral service came to a stop. People quietly left their seats, unsure what to do. Some relatives approached me with sympathy. Others looked at the woman with confusion. No one had answers. The minister quietly closed his Bible. I think, he said softly, perhaps today is not the day for speeches. He was right. How could anyone stand in front of us and describe Daniel as an honest family man when his greatest secret had just walked through the chapel doors? The flowers suddenly felt meaningless. The photographs on display no longer told the whole story. Every memory I had treasured now carried questions I couldn't answer. Had he really been working all those weekends? Or was he with them? The birthdays he missed. The anniversaries interrupted by sudden business trips. The countless nights spent in hotels. Had any of it been real? Or had I spent 15 years loving a man I never truly knew? As I looked toward Daniel's casket one last time, I realized something that hurt even more than losing him. I wasn't mourning only his death anymore. I was mourning the death of the life I believed we had shared. Because in a single heartbreaking morning, my husband hadn't just been buried. The truth about him had finally been uncovered. And that truth was far more devastating than death itself. 4 weeks after Daniel's funeral, I lived in a strange state of disbelief. Every morning I woke up hoping the entire nightmare had somehow been a misunderstanding. Maybe there had been another Daniel Harper. Maybe the photographs had been manipulated. Maybe there was some explanation that could make sense of everything. But every time I opened the folder containing the funeral program and that family photograph, reality came crashing back. The man I had trusted for 15 years had lived another life. Not for a few months. Not because of one terrible mistake. For more than a decade. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal. It was realizing that almost every memory I cherished now came with a question. Where was he really? Who was he really with? Which family was he thinking about when he kissed me goodbye before another business trip? One afternoon, while sorting through Daniel's office, I found myself surrounded by stacks of neatly organized files. Insurance documents. Tax returns. Business reports. Everything looked exactly as I expected. Daniel had always been incredibly organized. That was one of the things I admired about him. As I opened the bottom drawer of his desk, I noticed something unusual. A small metal lockbox. I frowned. I had never seen it before. Most people would probably stop there. But something inside me whispered that after everything I had already discovered, I couldn't afford to ignore another secret. I searched through the desk until I found a tiny key taped underneath one of the drawers. My hands trembled as I unlocked the box. Inside were several envelopes. A second cell phone. A passport. And documents I had never seen before. The passport immediately caught my attention. I opened it. Daniel's photograph looked back at me. But the name wasn't Daniel Harper. It was Daniel Collins. I stared at the page, convinced I had somehow read it wrong. I checked again. Same face. Different last name. My heart pounded. Why would my husband have another passport? The answer frightened me more than the question. Beneath the passport were bank statements from an account I had never known existed. The balance was enormous. Over $400,000. An account that had never appeared on our joint financial records. There were also mortgage documents for a house nearly 2 hours away from our home. The address meant nothing to me. I folded the papers carefully and sat in silence. I thought I had already discovered the worst possible truth. I was wrong. Every answer only created more questions. The next morning, I drove to the address listed on the documents. The neighborhood was quiet and well maintained. Children played in front yards. Neighbors walked their dogs. It looked like any ordinary suburban community. The house itself was beautiful. A 2-story brick home with white shutters and a swing hanging from a large oak tree. I parked across the street. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. This wasn't just another property. This was another home. Another life. As I watched, the front door opened. The same woman from the funeral stepped outside. She looked exhausted. The little boy ran after a soccer ball across the yard. The little girl sat on the porch reading a book. For a moment, I forgot why I was there. They looked like an ordinary family. A family that had been shattered just as completely as mine. I almost drove away. Instead, I walked toward the house. The woman noticed me immediately. Her expression became uncertain. I wasn't expecting you. I wasn't expecting any of this either. She nodded slowly. My name is Rebecca. I'm Claire. For several seconds, we simply stood there. Neither of us knew what to say. Finally, Rebecca invited me inside. The house felt strangely familiar. Not because I had ever been there. Because Daniel's presence seemed to exist in every room. Photographs covered the walls. Vacation pictures. Birthday celebrations. Christmas mornings. In every image, Daniel smiled exactly the way he smiled in our family photographs. I stared at one picture of him teaching the little boy how to ride a bicycle. Tears filled my eyes. He had taught Ethan the exact same way. Rebecca noticed where I was looking. He loved teaching Noah new things. I swallowed hard. He loved teaching Ethan too. The silence between us became almost unbearable. Finally, Rebecca spoke. I thought I was his only wife. So did I. He said he traveled because his territory covered several states. I gave a bitter laugh. He told me the same thing. We sat at the kitchen table for nearly 3 hours. Slowly, we compared memories. Dates. Vacations. Business trips. Anniversaries. Every timeline fit together like pieces of a puzzle neither of us wanted to solve. When Daniel told me he had an important conference in Seattle, he had actually been spending Christmas with Rebecca and the children. When Rebecca believed he was visiting clients in Chicago, he had been celebrating Ethan's birthday with us. Every excuse. Every delayed flight. Every canceled dinner. Every overnight meeting. It had all been carefully planned. Not once. Hundreds of times. Rebecca quietly stood and walked to a cabinet. She returned holding a stack of greeting cards. These are every anniversary card he ever gave me. I looked through them. The handwriting was unmistakably Daniel's. The words sounded painfully familiar. You are the love of my life. I can't imagine my world without you. I'll always choose you. My hands began shaking. I stood and walked toward the window. Because I had received cards with almost identical messages. He hadn't simply lied. He had duplicated an entire emotional life. Rebecca looked at me carefully. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Did you ever suspect anything?" I thought for a long moment. There were times he seemed distracted. Sometimes he missed important moments. But I trusted him. She looked down. So did I. Neither of us was foolish. Neither of us was careless. We had simply loved someone who had become an expert at deception. Over the next several weeks, Rebecca and I worked together to understand the full truth. We met with lawyers, financial investigators, insurance companies. Every new document revealed another hidden layer. There were additional credit cards, more secret accounts, even a storage unit filled with personal belongings divided between his two lives. It became painfully clear that Daniel had spent years maintaining two completely separate identities. The emotional weight of that realization was overwhelming. One evening, after another exhausting meeting with attorneys, I sat alone in my living room looking at our wedding photograph. For the first time since the funeral, I didn't cry. Instead, I looked at Daniel's smiling face and whispered, "Who are you?" It wasn't a question filled with anger anymore. It was genuine confusion. The man I married had loved me. I believed that. The man in Rebecca's photographs seemed to love her too. How could one person divide himself so completely? Maybe he believed he could keep both worlds forever. Maybe he convinced himself no one would ever discover the truth. But secrets have a way of surviving only as long as the person protecting them. Daniel had spent years building two families. Yet in the end, it took only one funeral to bring both of them together. And as painful as the truth was, Rebecca and I were beginning to understand something unexpected. Neither of us had lost to the other. We had both lost to the same lie. And that realization would change the way we saw each other forever. The first few weeks after Rebecca and I uncovered the truth felt like living inside someone else's life. Every conversation uncovered another lie. Every document answered one question while creating 5 more. At first, I thought I would spend the rest of my life hating her. After all, she was the woman I believed had stolen my husband. I'm sure she felt exactly the same about me. But life has a strange way of exposing the truth. The more we talked, the more obvious it became that neither of us had been the other woman. We had both been wives. We had both been deceived. And we had both built our futures around promises made by the same man. One Saturday afternoon, Rebecca called me. I found another box. My heart immediately sank. "Another one? I think you should come over." By then, visiting her house no longer felt as strange as it once had. It was still painful. But the pain had changed. The first time I entered that home, I saw another family. Now I saw another group of innocent people trying to understand the same impossible truth. When I arrived, Rebecca was sitting at the dining room table with several folders spread across the surface. The children were outside playing in the backyard. She looked exhausted. I was cleaning the attic. She pointed toward an old cardboard box. It was hidden behind Christmas decorations. I carefully opened it. Inside were dozens of photo albums. Some belonged to my family. Some belonged to Rebecca's. But what shocked me most were the albums that contained pictures from both lives. Daniel had organized everything by dates. Not by families. By dates. There was a photograph of him helping Ethan blow out birthday candles. The very next page showed him attending Noah's soccer game only 2 days later. Another page showed him celebrating my birthday. 3 days after that, there he was smiling beside Rebecca during their anniversary dinner. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. "He kept records of everything," I whispered. Rebecca nodded. As if he was managing 2 full-time jobs. There were calendars with handwritten notes. Flight itineraries. Hotel reservations. Gift receipts. Everything had been planned months in advance. Nothing had been accidental. Nothing. I closed the album and leaned back in my chair. I used to think our marriage fell apart because I wasn't enough. Rebecca looked at me. I thought the same thing. She took a deep breath. When he was distracted, I blamed myself. When he canceled plans, I thought I wasn't being supportive enough. I smiled sadly. I remember buying new dresses because I thought maybe I'd stopped being attractive. Rebecca laughed quietly through her tears. I changed my hairstyle for the same reason. For the first time since meeting her, we both laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because we finally realized how unfairly we had judged ourselves. We had spent years trying to fix problems we didn't create. A few days later, Rebecca suggested something unexpected. I think the kids should meet. I looked at her in surprise. You mean Ethan, Noah, Emma? They're siblings. The word felt almost impossible to say out loud. Siblings. Daniel had created a family connection none of us had ever known existed. At first, I wasn't sure it was a good idea. How do you explain something so complicated to children? But eventually we agreed. The meeting took place at a quiet park. Ethan had taken time off from college after everything that happened. He still struggled to understand how the father he admired could have hidden such an enormous secret. When Noah and Emma arrived with Rebecca, everyone looked nervous. No one knew what to say. Finally, Emma walked toward Ethan. Are you really my brother? Ethan smiled gently. I guess I am. She hugged him without hesitation. Watching that moment brought tears to every adult standing there. Children often accept difficult truths much faster than grown-ups. They weren't interested in blame. They simply wanted to know each other. Over the following weeks, they slowly built relationships. Ethan taught Noah how to play basketball. Emma asked endless questions about what Daniel had been like when he was younger. Sometimes the conversations were painful. Other times they were surprisingly joyful. Despite everything Daniel had done wrong, something beautiful had emerged from the truth. The children had found each other. One evening, Rebecca and I sat on her back porch watching them play in the yard. It's strange, she said quietly. What is? I expected to hate you forever. I smiled. I thought you hated me. I tried. So did I. We both laughed. Then Rebecca became serious. You know what finally changed everything? What? I realized you lost the same man I did. I nodded. And neither of us actually had the man we thought we did. The truth settled between us. Daniel had loved us in his own complicated way. Perhaps he believed he could make two families happy. Perhaps he convinced himself no one would ever be hurt. But love without honesty isn't love that can survive. Eventually, lawyers finalized the complicated legal matters. The insurance money was divided fairly. The hidden assets were uncovered. Both families received what the law determined was rightfully theirs. But no legal decision could repair the emotional damage. Months later, Rebecca invited Sophie, Emma, and Noah, along with Ethan and me, to celebrate Noah's birthday. At first, the idea felt impossible. Then I looked around the room. The children were laughing together. Rebecca was smiling while helping Noah cut the cake. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, the house didn't feel haunted by his lies. It felt filled with people choosing honesty instead. As the evening ended, Rebecca handed me an old framed photograph she had found in the attic. It was the only picture Daniel had kept of himself before either of us met him. A young man standing alone beside a lake. No wedding ring. No family. No secrets. Just a hopeful smile. I think you should have this, she said. I looked at the photograph for a long moment. I don't hate him anymore. Rebecca nodded. Neither do I. We'll never understand why he did it. No. But maybe we don't have to. I realized she was right. Some questions never receive satisfying answers. Some betrayals never fully make sense. What mattered now wasn't understanding Daniel. It was protecting the lives he had nearly destroyed. Rebecca reached across the table and squeezed my hand. We can't change what he did. No. But we can decide what happens next. For the first time since the funeral, I believed that was true. The two women who should have been enemies had become allies. Not because they had forgotten the lies, but because they refused to let those lies define the rest of their lives. And without realizing it, we were already taking the first steps towards something neither of us thought possible. Healing. Nearly a year had passed since Daniel's funeral. Sometimes it felt like only yesterday. Other times, it felt as though an entire lifetime had separated the woman I used to be from the woman I had become. Grief has a strange way of changing shape. In the beginning, it consumes every thought. Then, little by little, it becomes something quieter. It never completely disappears. It simply stops controlling your life. The first few months after discovering Daniel's secret had been filled with endless questions. Why? How? When did the lies begin? Did he ever truly love me? For a long time, I believed those answers would determine whether I could ever move forward. Eventually, I realized something important. Some questions never receive answers. And sometimes, healing begins the moment you stop demanding them. One Sunday afternoon, I was cleaning the attic when I found an old wooden box filled with letters Daniel had written to me during the first years of our marriage. I sat on the floor and carefully opened the first envelope. His handwriting instantly brought back memories. The letter spoke about our future. The family we hoped to build. The dreams we wanted to chase together. For a moment, I felt tears filling my eyes. Not because I wanted him back. Because I finally accepted that two truths could exist at the same time. The love we shared had been real. So had the betrayal. One did not erase the other. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the box. I wasn't throwing away my memories anymore. I simply wasn't allowing them to define my future. Later that week, Ethan came home for the weekend. He looked happier than he had in months. College had become easier. He had made new friends. He even laughed more often. As we sat together on the back porch drinking coffee, he looked at me thoughtfully. Mom? Yes? Can I ask you something? Always. Do you forgive Dad? The question lingered in the air. A year earlier, I wouldn't have known how to answer. Now I smiled gently. I forgive him. Ethan looked surprised. After everything? I don't forgive what he did. I forgive because I don't want to carry his mistakes for the rest of my life. He remained quiet. I used to think forgiveness meant pretending nothing happened. I shook my head. No. Forgiveness means accepting that what happened cannot be changed. It means refusing to let someone else's choices poison the rest of your life. Ethan slowly nodded. I think I'm starting to understand. You don't have to rush. Healing isn't a race. A few weeks later, Rebecca invited us to a small family picnic. By then, gatherings between our families had become surprisingly natural. The children no longer introduced themselves as strangers. They introduced themselves as siblings. Watching Ethan, Noah, and Emma laugh together reminded me that something beautiful had managed to grow from unimaginable pain. Not because Daniel deserved credit, but because the people he hurt chose compassion instead of resentment. During the picnic, Emma ran toward me carrying a drawing. I made this. She proudly handed it to me. The picture showed two houses connected by a large bridge. On one side stood Rebecca and her children. On the other stood Ethan and me. Across the top, she had written in colorful letters. Family is the people who choose to love each other. My eyes filled with tears. Children often understand life's biggest lessons better than adults. That evening, after everyone went home, Rebecca and I remained sitting outside watching the sunset. She smiled. "Do you ever think about him?" I looked toward the fading sunlight. "Sometimes. So do I. I used to think I'd spend the rest of my life angry." I nodded. "I thought I'd spend mine wondering why I wasn't enough." Rebecca looked at me. "Now." I smiled softly. "Now I know his choices were never a reflection of my worth." She took a deep breath. "I wish we had met under different circumstances." "So do I. But maybe we were meant to help each other survive them." She laughed. "I think you're right." Several months later, our lawyer called to let us know that the final legal matters surrounding Daniel's estate had finally been completed. For the first time since his death, there were no more documents to sign. No more hidden accounts to investigate. No more unanswered financial questions. That chapter of our lives had officially ended. To mark the occasion, Ethan suggested we all visit the cemetery together. At first, I wasn't sure. But something inside me said it was time. The six of us stood quietly in front of Daniel's grave. Fresh flowers rested beside the headstone. No one spoke for several minutes. Finally, Noah placed a small baseball on the grass. "You said Dad loved baseball." Ethan smiled. "He did." Emma placed her drawing beside the flowers. The same picture of two houses connected by a bridge. Rebecca quietly wiped away tears. I stepped forward and looked at Daniel's name carved into the stone. For years, I believed this man was the center of my world. Then I believed he had destroyed it. Now I understood something different. One person's choices can change your life. But they never have the power to define the rest of it. I whispered softly. "I hope you found the peace you never found here." The wind moved gently through the trees. No dramatic signs appeared. No miraculous moment. Just silence. Peaceful silence. As we walked back toward our cars, Ethan slipped his arm around my shoulders. "You okay?" I smiled. "I think I finally am." Driving home that afternoon, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the children laughing together. A family that should never have existed. Yet somehow, despite everything, they had become each other's greatest source of strength. Daniel had spent years building two separate lives through lies. In the end, those lies collapsed. But the people left behind chose something stronger. Truth. Forgiveness. And hope. I finally understood that healing doesn't mean forgetting the past. It means refusing to let the past steal your future. Some people spend their entire lives searching for revenge. I searched for peace. And I found it the moment I realized that my story was never really about a man who lived two lives. It was about the woman who learned she could build one honest, meaningful life after surviving the greatest betrayal she had ever known. Because the deepest wounds don't always leave permanent scars. Sometimes, they become the places where the strongest version of yourself is finally born. And that was the ending I chose. Not one written by Daniel's lies, but one written by truth, courage, and the quiet strength to begin again.